ago, close to 500 artillery and tank shells were fired on various positions in Syria and Iraq. So, cross-border, are you aware of cross-border strikes carried out by Turkey in Syria?
Strikes against Daesh inside Syria by members of the coalition is a good thing. That's what we want. We want to go out.
In the view of the U.S., is there such a thing as Syria's sovereignty at this point?
What we want is for Syria to be whole and pluralistic and free, and to have a government that can protect its own people, and to eventually, yes, continue to care for its sovereignty.
But the U.S. recognizes sovereignty now?
Syria is a nation. There's no question about that. But it's led by a man who's lost all legitimacy to govern. And we've made no bones about the fact that regardless of the borders that Syria has, and internationally recognized borders, there's an international coalition that has the authority to go in and to deal with a group like that.
The Russian airstrikes. Now, the Russians are claiming that they're hitting so many ISIL sites and camps and so on. You, on the other hand, say that most of these strikes miss ISIS or are directed toward someone else. How do you determine whether which reports are correct? I mean, how do you determine the veracity or the lack thereof of Russia's reports?
We have a variety of sources of information that when taken together, gives us a good degree of confidence in what we see the Russian military forces striking. Mm-hmm. And they continue to strike the preponderance, the vast majority of targets continue to be opposition groups and not, in fact, ISIL. What we've seen them do, where they're hitting, where they're operating, it would not lead one to conclude that that is their goal. You would have to look at the evidence on the face of it and have to assume that what they are in fact trying to do is prop up the Assad regime. As I said, we know where they're hitting, and it's not against ISIL predominantly. Yesterday I said better than 90%. We still believe that that's true. Better of the targets are opposition groups. To continue to drop ordnance inside Syria from their aircraft, we'd like that ordnance to be aimed at ISIL.
In Syria, Russian ships in the Caspian Sea fired cruise missiles at the terror group's positions, targeting their oil reserves. So far this week, Russia says it has destroyed 15 oil facilities in Syria and 525 trucks carrying oil. 600 militants were also reported killed. Officials estimate the damage to the oil reserves have cost the terror group more than $1 million.
Fighting ISIS.
They're not fighting ISIS.
They are. Oh, Joe, I mean...
Well, there's very little evidence that they're going after ISIL inside Syria. If they want to play a constructive role in that effort, then again, that's a conversation we're willing to have. At the same time, so far, when you just look at the vast majority of the targets they're hitting opposition groups and not terrorist organizations and not ISIL specifically.
Those fuel trucks were moving back and forth. We saw them and through ISR, and the decision was not made in the White House to attack them or not. You can't tell me they were moving all that stuff back and forth for over a year and we didn't know about it. I mean, it's just not possible. I think you may want to correct the record because I certainly knew.
I can, not a matter of correction at all. I can clarify if that would help. That is the case, and what the air commanders were able to do was identify those trucks and in a classified setting, I can describe exactly how that information was obtained.
As I said before, though, the vast majority of the strikes we've seen them conduct to date continue to be against opposition groups and not against ISIL. You take actions which speak pretty loudly, and if you look at what they're doing, what they're hitting, who they're hitting, where they're hitting them, largely inside Syrian government-controlled areas, largely against opposition groups, largely in support of the Assad regime, it's difficult to get from that to a point where you can say with certainty that they're interested in going after ISIL and al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist groups.
I want to be careful about confirming information, but it does appear that they were in areas where there probably were not ISIL forces, and that is precisely one of the problems with this whole approach.
And it's only going to give more breathing space and oxygen to ISIL, who certainly isn't getting a whole lot of pressure from Russian aircraft.
That means it's more than a week since Metrojet's plane was destroyed over Sinai, and we're still waiting for a conclusive explanation of how and why. ISIL says it destroyed the plane as a revenge for Russia's air campaign in Syria.
The Russians are saying today that 40% of ISIS infrastructure destroyed since Russian operation launched a week ago. What do you think about their statement?
I have no ability to judge the battle damage assessment of Russian aircraft. I can tell you is, based on where we've seen them hit, and we have many sources of information to gather this, certainly the great majority, greater than 90%, is not in ISIL territory and not against ISIL groups or units or activities.
And one on them.
If you just take a look at where we know they're hitting, and again, we don't have perfect visibility into every building that's struck, but we have a general sense, a pretty good understanding, and we have many ways of knowing that.
Yeah, I don't dispute that. Has Moscow officially requested that information, the location information?
Not that I'm aware of. But again, you'd have to.
And how
I'd have
do
to
you,
go to
and
the
number
Defense
two is
Department on
how
that.
do you distinguish between moderate forces and ISIL? How does the U.S. do that?
We know where ISIL is, and that's what our focus is militarily, is against ISIL, and we have again various means of information to know where they are. And
the U.S. knows for certain who is who on the ground. Is that the case?
we have a very good idea.
What's confusing about. On the one hand, U.S. officials sound very definitive and certain when they talk about who Russia is targeting. On the other hand, we hear U.S. officials say, oh, it's so difficult to identify who modern Syrian rebels are. U.S. officials have actually been critical of this definition of moderate Syrian opposition, but the label suddenly becomes solid when the conversation is about Russia. How can U.S. officials be so certain and so doubtful about the same thing at the same time?
It doesn't mean that the opposition groups still don't exist. Doesn't mean that we don't have an idea of where they are and what they're doing, because obviously we're supporting them.
We're not in a position to analyze or try to collect specific information about their targeting. You should talk to Russian military authorities about what they think they are or they're not hitting.
Who are these moderate groups that have been targeted by Russia?
I don't have a list of every group and every individual or unit that's been targeted by these Russian strikes. I'd ask you to talk to Moscow about further identification of what they're targeting and what their battle damage assessment. And I'm not in a position now to confirm ground activity by the Russian military. That's something for them to speak to. So
you guys keep asserting that there are moderate groups. There are so many different groups in Syria. I mean, they're probably in the hundreds. How do you determine or decide that this group in this particular area is moderate and this group is less moderate? And so
there is, Saeed, there is, Saeed, as you know, a wide, disparate collection of groups that are in opposition to the Assad regime. They don't all share every goal in common.
ISIL militants have seized almost all of the ancient Syrian city of Palmyra. That's It follows fierce fighting with government forces. The apparent capture is the first time the self-proclaimed Islamic State has taken control of a city directly from the Syrian army.
Several months. The regime coming under increasing pressure by opposition groups, losing more what was once government-controlled territory to opposition groups. I think that's
opposition groups to
plain.
include ISIL, or opposition groups that are the ones that you support?
I'm talking about the political opposition groups in general on ISIL, and we've been, I think, very honest about the fact that that in Syria they have continued to lose.
Right.
The Sunni extremists claim these are the 250 Syrian soldiers they captured during their week-long bloody battle to take Al-Tabqa military base, the last stronghold for Bashar al-Assad's regime in Raqqa province. A large swath of eastern Syria now controlled by ISIS.
I don't have anything new
My
beyond
question
what
is,
they conveyed.
do you think that there are 15,000 moderate Syrians?
I don't think our Secretary of Defense and Chairman would state that if they didn't think we could find 15,000 moderate Syrians to train and equip, yes.
So you think that that's a realistic, that is realistic?
Yes.
That there were only about 60 Syrian fighters that had been trained in our train and equip program and reinserted. We've heard reports about the attacks on those individuals when they were reinserted back into Syria. Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five.
The strategy that we're pursuing in Syria is against ISIL. Our focus militarily is against ISIL, always has been, remains that. Politically, what needs to happen is a transition in Syria, and as we've long said, there's not going to be a military solution to the civil war in Syria. Obviously, there are military operations being conducted against ISIL by the coalition. That's going to continue.
If you say your military efforts are exclusively focused on ISIS, if you say you want to stop the flow of refugees, why did you bomb a Japanese-built power station in Aleppo, destroyed it, creating additional hardships for the Syrians and probably causing some additional refugees to leave the country?
Not going to be in a position, and I wouldn't begin to be in a position to speak to each and every target from each and every operation. Turkey has continued to come under attack by PKK terrorists, and we recognize their right to defend themselves against those attacks. And it was in retaliation for recent attacks by the PKK that Turkey conducted these most recent strikes.
Doesn't trouble you at all that the Turks are going after people who have been very effective, perhaps the most effective on the ground against ISIL?
They attacked Turkey. Turkey has a right to self-defense. We're recognizing that. The fight against ISIL is broader than this, broader than one group. But to be clear, the fight inside Syria is largely about ISIL, and the Turks themselves have acknowledged that will be their aim inside Syria too.
You deny the allegation that Turkey basically used its part in fighting ISIS as a ploy just to go after the Kurds.
I'm not going to characterize Turkish motives. We don't observe a connection between what they did about going after PKK and what we're trying to do as a coalition against ISIL.
Islamic State is now considered to be the most potent rebel group in Syria, with rivals complaining that it spends more time fighting them than Syrian government forces.
Reference then that these Turkmen rebels, they have the right to defend themselves. Yeah, I mean,
it's unclear to me it's unclear to me whether they were getting the strike, whether they were being struck or not.
That right applies to everyone, does it not? Not just to the rebels who are supported by the West.
I'm not going to. I mean, where are you going with this?
I mean, do you think that everybody has the right to defend themselves?
Well, we said very clearly that
right?
people have the right to
Including the
defend
Assad
themselves.
regime?
No.
No, they don't have the right to defend themselves.
No, look, there's a clear no, but I'm not going to accept your premise that I'm somehow giving.
Okay, well,
Assad,
you were the one that raised it.
Assad the right.
This soldier, who we're told is named Abu Sakkar, he's a well-known rebel leader. He's leaning over the body of a regime soldier. He's carved into it. He removes what looks to be the man's heart, and then he says, "I swear to God, we will eat your hearts out, you soldiers of Bashar, you dogs."
I mean, what Assad... Wait, no. Now that you've raised it,
what
Assad's
raise it,
regime
Mark.
is doing is hardly self-defense.